In Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, there was a horrible secret that someone wanted kept hidden. And for over 100 years, they got their evil way. But this secret refused to stay buried. This is the story of a woman who had been erased from history. She'd been murdered, and her remains hidden beneath the ground in a wooden barrel. But thanks to a series of coincidences that spanned over 100 years, her story, at least a good part of it, can now be told. Tonight, in this episode of the Canadian Gothic, we're going to hear about Saskatchewan's oldest and coldest case. This is the story of Alice Spence, formerly known as the Woman in the Well.
Alice Spence is not invisible anymore.
Forensic anthropologist Ernie Walker says Alice Spence's body was placed in a barrel and dropped down a well.
We're going to enter this story by following along with some otherwise forgettable excavation work happening not far from present-day downtown Saskatoon in the summer of 2009. At the corner of 108th Street and Central Avenue, which is now home to a strip mall that's seen better days, a work crew was excavating the underground fuel tanks from an old service station. As the machines tore into the earth, they uncovered something unexpected, the remains of a long-abandoned well. Although this well hadn't appeared on any of their site plans, it wasn't ancient or anything that would have typically delayed the crew's work. But as you can likely guess by the fact that we're discussing it here, this well was different. It had been silently holding a secret. When crews surveyed it with just a visual glance, they could see that something had become stuck not far below the level they were working at. It was clearly a wooden barrel, and one that didn't fall to the bottom of the well where moisture and darkness would have kept it hidden. This barrel was suspended within the well. It turns out that chance, in one of its many forms, led to the barrel becoming caught on a broken board while falling down the well, and it's been held safely there for over a century. When the barrel was brought to the surface, so was tonight's story. Its contents told a horrific tale. There was a burlap sack containing one full set of female human bones. There was a woman's fitted jacket and a skirt, a broken necklace, a rolled-up set of men's trousers and a matching vest, and there was unmistakable evidence that the woman's end involved violence. She was partially dismembered. Police knew immediately that they were facing a centuries-old murder, and that wasn't going to be easy to solve. But like the board that prevented the barrel's full descent down the well, another stroke of luck was on the Woman in the Well's side. As you recall, the excavation happening on this site related to buried fuel tanks from an old gas station. For years, this gas station had been operating on the ground above her, and the endless drops of gasoline and oil that came along with its operation had assisted in preserving the barrel's contents. So the investigators knew they were going to have a shot. The next steps were obvious. Who used this well? Who was the woman in the well? And ultimately, who killed her? The first question, relating to the origin of the well, that was the easiest riddle to solve. What is now a parking lot of a strip mall had for decades been a gas station, but if you go back even further than that, over a century ago, this was the site of a notorious hotel. The Shore Hotel was built in 1912, and it had served what was then the town of Sutherland, a community on the outskirts of the then new city of Saskatoon. The hotel had a bit of a reputation. It was lively, but it was unsavory. Alcohol freely flowed into many of the nearly anonymous visitors who flowed in and out of the hotel's low-priced rooms and bar. The Shore Hotel was seen as so unpleasant, Sutherland Town Council records show that funds were used to build two separate streetcar shelters outside the front doors. One shelter was to be used for hotel guests, and the other for the women and children who didn't want to associate with whatever was going on in that hotel. But fortunately, for the more modest residents of Sutherland, they wouldn't have to tolerate the Shore Hotel for long. Just 3 years after welcoming its first guests, Saskatchewan voted in favor of an alcohol prohibition, and this led to the hotel's value collapsing sharply. By 1919, the town seized the building for unpaid taxes, and just a few short years later, the Shore Hotel was demolished with plans to redevelop the site. So the investigators had no idea who the woman in the well was, but they knew that the well was dug during the construction of the Shore Hotel, and presumably it was sealed upon its demolition. So they knew they were trying to solve a crime that would have happened between 1912, when the hotel was built, and 1919, when it was demolished and the well buried. So adding that passage of time, with the fact that the crime occurred in an area with an endless supply of anonymous, transient types coming and going, they knew this case was going to be an uphill battle to solve. And if they wanted a chance, they needed to know the name of that woman in the well. And they tried everything that 2009's investigative scientists would allow. They investigated any and all missing persons cases related to the town of Sutherland's history, but that led them nowhere. They obtained her DNA profile, but no surprise, they found no match in their database. And then they went public with the case. Their public appeal included images of what they believed the woman in the well would have looked like before her death. But nothing came from that either. But what they were able to do was at least provide her with a more comfortable resting place. Without justice and without a name, the bones were buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, it's just about to get interesting. In 2008, forensic science evolved in a way that cold case detectives could have only dreamed about just years prior. They now had the possibility of investigative genetic genealogy. This is a technique that blends traditional family tree research with modern DNA science with the goal of identifying an unknown individual. Investigators start the process by obtaining a DNA sample from the unknown remains. And that sample is compared against the ever-growing databases where people voluntarily upload their own DNA for ancestry and genealogy purposes. Investigators then go on the hunt for partial matches, which reveal family connections, like distant cousins, for example. And by narrowing down the extended relatives to immediate family, investigators can often identify the unknown person or at least their close relatives. Saskatoon police saw this emerging tool as their big chance to give the woman in the well back her name. The case was handed to Othram, a private lab that specializes in this type of work. From the DNA profile found on her skeletal remains, they compared it against public databases, and yes, threads began to appear. They found relatives scattered across Alberta, the United States, and some as far away as Ireland. But they were all distant relatives. But it was still a great starting point for the more traditional police work that was going to follow. Police in Toronto had a newly formed genetic genealogy team that partnered with Saskatoon's investigators to begin building a family tree and look for that missing branch. And it didn't take long before they found it. In no time at all, the woman in the well had her name back. It was Alice Spence. And knowing her name and the fact that she was likely killed between 1912 and 1919, Saskatoon police were really getting somewhere. But before we get to where they're going, let's take a quick break, and when we get back, we're going to learn all about Alice's life and look for clues on who may have put her in that barrel over 100 years ago. Now, as I mentioned before the break, investigative genetic genealogy blends DNA analysis with typical ancestry type work. So as the hard DNA type science was happening, her story and her family history was being organized. And here's what they found. The woman in the well was born Alice Burke in Duluth, Michigan, back in 1881. She was of Irish descent and was one of 5 children. After finishing schooling, she worked as a seamstress and a clerk. In 1904, she was married to Charles Spence, and a year later, the couple welcomed a daughter, Idella. In 1913, Alice and Charles moved north into Canada and ultimately settled in Sutherland, Saskatchewan. She next appears in the 1916 census. Alice, Charles, and Idella were recorded as living together, now in Saskatoon. And it's at this point where things get a little tricky. The records begin telling a confusing story. In 1918, a newspaper reported on a fire that destroyed the Spence home, but the article specifically says that the family was away at the time and there were no casualties. The trail next picks up in the 1921 census. But this time, Alice is absent, and Charles is listed as living only with Idella and now a housekeeper. And just 2 years after that, it gets a bit more complicated. A death record is found showing Charles having died of a heart attack. The obituary doesn't mention Alice, but lists him as being a widower. Now, all this information matches up with what the investigators had expected. Alice vanished from the historical record sometime between 1916 and 1921, and the Shore Hotel operated from 1912 to 1919. So when you put all that together, that means Alice would have been killed and put in the well between 1916 and 1919. And that leaves us with just 2 missing pieces of the puzzle. Who did this and why? And I'm just going to tell you right off the jump, those pieces are pretty frustrating. Police have said that they have evidence that shows that Alice was assaulted and murdered before being forced into that barrel. And they also say they believe they know who did it. But here's the frustrating part. They've chosen not to release that information.
Sergeant Darren Funk says he has evidence of who was involved in the death, but refused to share the suspect's name.
We believe we know who did it, but it's 100 years old. That person does not have the right to defend themselves in court today, so we're going to leave it at that.
The case now considered closed.
So in effect, they've declared the case closed. Alice's identity has been restored, but her killer remains unnamed. The odd twist in all this is that their secret has successfully remained buried in that well. But I guess the good that comes out of this is that Alice doesn't need to hide with it from now on, and her family was able to give her a proper burial, one that has her name on the headstone.
Cindy Camp, Spence's great-granddaughter, admits she first thought the investigators' call was a scam.
The idea that someone was reaching out to us about a relative we didn't know under such unusual circumstances seemed too strange to be true.
Camp says her grandmother never spoke about her family, and she's grateful to finally have the details come to light.
Learning about Alice's life and the way she had been hidden away from history for so long is both surreal and emotional for our family.
Camp says she plans to get a gravestone made to honor her great-grandmother, whose story she now knows.
I want to thank you for joining me for this episode of the Canadian Gothic. Now I'm going to start wrapping up this episode, but before I do, I have some thanks. First, I'd like to thank the Saskatoon police who've never given up on the woman in the well, and the Toronto police who were able to help connect the dots. Next, a big thank you to Linz from the Dystopian Simulation podcast and Monty Datta, who collectively have contributed the voiceovers and music for the show. And then lastly, and most importantly, I want to give a thanks to every one of you listening, as without your interest and your support, this show would be as pointless as it would be impossible. And on that topic of support, let me thank the newest subscribers to the premium feed. Claire, Angelia, and Joyce, thank you for going premium. If anyone else would like to support the show, you can help us out here in a variety of ways. First of all, a premium feed subscription costs just a couple bucks a month, and that money will fund the creation of new episodes. But the premium feed will also give you those episodes 2 days early, give them to you ad-free, and give you access to a back catalog of episodes. If that sounds like something you're interested in, you can go premium at thecanadiangothic.com/subscribe. And even if you don't want to go premium, you can still support the show by sharing this episode on social media and recommending the show to some friends. Your support is very much appreciated. So with all that said, until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.